But again, thank you, Michael. He went outside to get us more, but thank you, Michael, for the kind words. I always enjoy coming in here because the college students, we get to meet on Tuesdays, and that is a great pleasure. I enjoy what I do with the college group, and man, it has just been such a blessing to see what has happened with them. The last couple of weeks, we've had Mr. Evan Golden come back a couple weeks ago because of one hurricane. And this last week, we actually had Miss Lauren Carter come back because of the other hurricane. And so do know to just be praying for our college students who are out and about in several different areas in the country, and those that are still at school. I know Lauren, she's at Eckerd, and so she is right in Tampa, St. Pete area. And so that school was right in the middle of the hurricane. And so from conversations I've had with her dad and several people, just be praying. They were possibly looking at doing school online the rest of the semester, looking at staying home. And so I know for her, she does not want to do that. She enjoys Tampa way more than Memphis, and I can't blame her. But just be praying for them, because that's a serious time of your life for growing and being away from your parents for the first time. And now she's having to be home. But I will say this, because I'm doing online seminary as well. Online is not the same. Online is very difficult with school. And so, but again, like I said, I'm thankful for the opportunity I have each and every Tuesday night and each and every Sunday morning to come and share the good news of Jesus Christ with our college and career group. But I love being able to do other things. And so here lately, I've been able to teach the Wednesday night group with the children's, with Tanner, and help out with that. And that's just been enjoyable as well. We do a rotation, so every 10 minutes you get a new group come in, and that's exciting just to be able to share, a short 10-minute lesson, but just to help them understand what it means to follow after Christ. So tonight, we're going to strap in and get our seatbelts on, because we're going to be going through a whole book of the Bible in one night. So somebody did ask if this was going to be graded, because I know the last couple of times I taught down here it was. The sermon itself will not be graded. I don't have to have that on, but I do appreciate I can kind of double dip, if you know what I mean. This is going to be a paper, and so I will be talking about the book of Ruth and how it foreshadows the coming Christ. And so essentially the whole night we're going to be looking at Ruth, all of Ruth. We'll read a couple of the verses in Ruth. We'll skip around. But we're going to have an understanding of who Ruth is, why it's important to understand the whole story, and how it points to Jesus. All right? Because if we don't know, all of the Old Testament foreshadows, it tells of a coming Christ that would save his people from their sins. There were types, what they call typology. You can get really hairy areas and gray areas, because some people just like to point to every random thing in the Old Testament and say, see, that's Jesus. We need to be careful of that, but there are types, like David was a type. He was not Jesus, but he was pointing forward to a better king, a better king who would have a better solution to a problem, and that was salvation. So in the book of Ruth, we find a tragic story of a woman who had lost everything in Naomi. Her husband and her sons had died, and she was left with two daughters-in-law to mourn over them. Well, Naomi was a Jew, and so she had actually moved to the town of Moab. She had moved to the nation of Moab from Bethlehem, and so now she is traveling back to Bethlehem. Well, right before she gets to the city, this is kind of the introduction to this first chapter, right before she gets to the city, she has a conversation with her two daughters-in-law. She says, look, you guys, you ladies, I'm going into my city. I'm going back to my country with my God. Just give me a kiss and y'all go back to the city of Moab. You go back to your gods. You go back to your culture, your understanding of life. You don't have any reason to stay with me. Well, why would she do that? Well, one, she looked at herself as just kind of used up. But also, if you read in Ruth 1, it talks about Naomi feeling like she had been accursed from God. She felt like God was punishing her for something that she had done. Well, if you know the culture of the Moabites, they were not believers in God. They did not believe in the God of the Bible. Well, what she did was she went and got married, like all of the Jews had done during Judges. They were falling away from God and going against God. She went against God and his wishes, and she married a Moabite, moved to his country, and more than likely, because she was submissive to her husband, started worshiping false gods. So there was a reason why she felt this way. And so now she's lost her husband, she's lost her sons. Now she's with her daughters-in-law in the hopelessness right outside the gates of the city. Well, the people in the city, the people in Bethlehem and all the Jewish women more than likely saw contempt. They were looking with contempt on her because she had run away. She had gone away from everything that she had believed as a child. She had gone away, and now she's essentially coming back pleading, needing help. So Naomi is in a very difficult position. Well, in the book of Ruth, throughout all of this, we're going to see this foreshadowing, this future events with Jesus, the kinsman redeemer, and his people. So just right then and there, as we stop with Ruth and Naomi having this conversation, we're going to see some foreshadowing to say we're in a current predicament that we can't get ourselves out of, right? And Jesus needed to make a way. God needed to make a way in the Old Testament for Ruth and Naomi. Well, he had done this already with Adam and Eve whenever they sinned in the garden against him. He made a way with Noah and his family in the ark. He helped those who would go into the desert plains in Joshua. And just before the book of Ruth, he actually took the judge, Samson, who in most biblical understandings, they would say that Samson, even though he's the most talked about judge, he was the worst judge. He did the most wrong, he did the most falling away from God in his time of being the judge over Israel. But he's talked about because he was a strong guy and he killed a lot of people with a donkey bone, right? But Samson, God even used him. He redeemed him through the slaying of the Philistines and their God. When he pulled down the pillars after they had blinded him and captured him, he pulled down the pillars and killed all the Philistines and destroyed their God. Well, Jesus over time would redeem his people to himself with his death, his burial, and his resurrection. He would overcome the sins of the people through his precious sacrifice on Calvary. So all this pushing forward and noticing that Jesus is going to make a way comes back to Boaz. All right? Boaz is going to purchase Ruth out of a slave-based lifestyle. Jesus purchases people out of the bondage of sin. So 3 things tonight that we're going to notice and we're going to illustrate. These aren't the points, but we're going to illustrate through the readings of Ruth and the entirety of the Bible are, just like Boaz, God never gives up on his people. Jesus purchases his prize out of the darkest of places. Christ's people, like Ruth, are no longer known as widows and sinners, but as the bride and people of a risen king. Tonight we're going to focus on the foreshadowing circumstances of Ruth and the coming Boaz, and sinners with the coming Jesus. So a lot of times in class or if you go through long studies of books, hopefully you'll start to notice in the Old Testament when you go through them, you'll start to realize like, man, a lot of this stuff talks about like, it just makes sense for it to start talking about the New Testament and talking about Jesus and pushing forward to Jesus. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So we need to know the background of Ruth before we begin. Well, we know that Ruth and Judges were written by Samuel. It was written before the time of Ezekiel and was influential in its composition of a short narrative of how the bloodline of David came to be. At the end of Ruth, we'll get to that at the very end, but at the end of Ruth in chapter 4, we'll see that the genealogy of David is actually mentioned. That's what ends the book of Ruth. All right. I got these next 5 things from the New American Commentary on Ruth. I thought they were excellent, so I was just going to say them. But the reasons for writing Ruth: 1, God will not let his promises to Israel and Judah and David die. 2, God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform and his goals to achieve. 3, this is scripture, this is Romans 8:28. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. 4, genuine piety is expressed primarily in devotion, sensitivity, grace, and kindness towards others and opens to the working of God. And then 5, God's grace knows no boundaries. Even a despised Moabitess, that's the term for Moabite, is incorporated into the nation of Israel. And not only that, in fact, the royal and messianic line has Moabite blood in it. All right, so let's pray, and then we'll dive down into these 3 points that y'all have. Dear God, I thank you for tonight. I thank you for the opportunity that we have, Lord, just to open your word, to understand what it means, Lord, to just draw closer to you, Lord, to understand, Lord, where you would have us. God, we are thankful that you know all things, you have seen all things, and Lord, you are a great redeemer. Lord, I love you, and thank you for this time that we have together. In your name, amen. All right, so number one, we see Ruth's unfortunate circumstance, and then man's biggest need. So all three of the points are going to be kind of split. So you'll see Ruth's unfortunate circumstance in the Old Testament, and then you'll see man's biggest need, obviously all of the Bible. At the beginning of Ruth, it's noted that Naomi and Ruth are both coming to Bethlehem to seek asylum from the horror that had been ensnared by them in the last several years. What do they have? They have each other, right? They have each other to look at, to be with. Because right before this, she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you will go, I will go." See, Naomi gave the option to both of her daughter-in-laws, and one of them decided, I do want to go back to comfort. I want to go back to what I feel is good for me. But Ruth said, no, I want to follow you. I want to be with you, but mainly I want your God to be my God. I want to follow you to truth. So, again, like I said before, Naomi, when she comes back to Bethlehem, she comes in despair over what she feels God is against her. Ruth continues to say that she wants to be with her and that she wants to be with her God, that her God will become Ruth's God. So by the end of the first chapter, we see them arrive at Bethlehem, and immediately the people are stirred as they come to the outside of the city. So if you turn to Ruth chapter 1, we'll read verses 19 through 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" So there's two things that happen here that cause them to be stirred. One, Naomi was known throughout Bethlehem. She was known, they knew who she was. They knew that she had left, okay? So that would be one reason. But then two, Naomi brings back a Moabite to Bethlehem. That's concerning, right? This is somebody that doesn't believe the things that they believe. And so essentially, Naomi is very concerned about the situation that she's in. She realizes that she's in a bad place and she needs help, and so is Ruth. Well, Ruth and Naomi at this point in the story, they're in a bad spot. They have essentially lost everything, and in the culture of the day, it was not even possible for Naomi to give Ruth another husband. Because she talks about this after this. She says, "Look, I'm too old to be married again, or too old to get married again and then have a kid, and then you would have to wait on him." That's essentially what she was saying. Look, you don't want that, because you'd be like 90 years old, which if you look back at the beginning of Genesis and all that, you'll know that Abraham and his wife and Sarah had a baby really old, but this was past that, and Ruth was like, "Look, I'm not doing that." And Naomi said, "I can't do that either." Okay? And so they've essentially understood that there's no way for this to happen, for her to have another husband because of Naomi. Well, the position that they were in is just like the position of man before Jesus enters the scene. So what we've seen so far is we see that Naomi and Ruth, they're in a bad spot. They're outside of the city. They haven't come in yet, and they know we're in trouble. We need help. Well, before the time of Jesus, there's a period of silence. Does anybody remember how many years were in between the Old Testament and the New Testament? 400. Yeah, 400 years. That's a long time. Meaning that no one had heard or spoke on behalf of God in over 400 years. So that's chilling in its own right, but to think that one of the last prophecies given to the people was from Malachi saying this: "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." It's one of the last things out of a prophet's mouth is the great and dreadful day of the Lord is going to come to you because of the things that you're doing, the falling away from God that you're doing. The people that followed after God, they were drifting away. And at the point of Jesus' birth, they were actively even trying to stop the coming Messiah. Herod wanted to kill the infant Jesus so much so that he actively went out and killed all the babies. And guess where? Just like in Ruth, they're in the setting is Bethlehem. He's murdering infants. In Matthew 2:16, it talks about that. The people of God, they were in a mess and they were desperate for salvation. Isaiah 65, 2-3 says this about the provoking of the nation of Israel against God. I spread out my hands all the day to a rebellious people. This is the prophet speaking of God, who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices, a people who provoke me to my face continually. The people of God had completely turned away from him. They had turned to their own devices and desires and shared that God was not important to them. They needed to be redeemed. Well, we need to talk about redemption before we get further into the story. What does it mean to be redeemed? Well, redemption is a word implying helplessness. The picture of redemption is one of held captive by forces that someone cannot overcome. Only a third party can come to intervene, to rescue. Redemption never comes by our own efforts, and even spiritually, redemption cannot happen without a redeemer. This word is precious because it reminds followers of Jesus that relationship with him has been purchased at great cost. One of my favorite hymns, I grew up very conservative, and so we sang only hymns from a hymnal. And so one of my favorite hymns, though, was Redeemed by the Blood of the Lamb. So I'm going to say one of those lines from Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed through his infinite mercy, his child, and forever I am. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed, redeemed, his child, and forever I am. What a beautiful illustration this song paints to what had to be paid for us in our redemption. All right, so number 2, we now get to see Boaz, the one who comes to deliver Ruth from her despair, just like Jesus, the one who comes to deliver his people from bondage. So not long after the story of Ruth begins, we meet a man named Boaz. 2 verse 1 says this, Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So we know that Boaz is related to Naomi through marriage. We know he's related to Elimelech, which, if you don't know, Elimelech was her husband who had passed. Okay? Ruth 2, though, actually sets the stage for this mood of what's kind of going on in these conversations with Ruth and everybody else. So we see Naomi and how everybody responds to her, but now verse 2, And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi. It's very interesting. Ruth is the only one that has a label, and her label as a Moabite was not a good thing. They did not like Moabites. They did not want them present in their town. They didn't enjoy them. They thought that they were sinful, greedy, awful people. Well, this label of her as Moabite dictated the foreign territory that Ruth had placed herself into. As Ruth goes out for food for her and Naomi, she winds up actually in the fields of Boaz. Through conversations with one of his managers in chapter 2, he finds out who she is. Boaz finds out who she is and what she's doing. He makes mentions of all the dangers that she's actually going to put herself into, because what she's doing is she's reaping the harvest. And so at that time, they were only allowed to go on the outside of the fields and reap the harvest, essentially the excess that they had. Well, that's a dangerous spot to be in. One, because it was public, and so you had the ability to run into anybody. And at that point, people that were evil or wrong or doing something wrong were the ones that were always on the outside of the property. And so you'll see later on in chapter 2, you'll read about how one of the reapers says, look, if you go out there, you have the ability to possibly be assaulted, like taken and killed even. You don't want to do that. Well, by the end of the day, we see that at the end of chapter 2, she's keeping close to the young woman of Boaz. She's gleaning all the things that are close to the women of Boaz. But we also see this, what Boaz does for her and Naomi. Naomi told her to go and reap the harvest, to go and get food for them for the night. They needed enough food to make it through the night. Well, what does Boaz do? 2:14 says this, and at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied. And she even had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz said, well, wait, what are you doing? So I'll paraphrase the end. Like, wait, what are you doing? Tell you what, I'm going to get them to give you the excess that they have. You bring that back to Naomi. So what Naomi has told her to do is just get food for the night. What she comes back with is more. It's more than what they needed. Man, how many times does God answer our prayers more than what we asked? All right? How many times do we come to God in need of something, and yet God gives so much more in return, and we weren't even expecting it? We came to God in a physical sense saying, man, I really need this done in my life, and God answers all of that and even more through what he can do. So we see Boaz, he meets Ruth's physical needs, and then he creates safety for her in a time of peril. So right after this, after he tells her that he's going to give her that, he says that you can actually start to go even more so into my property, into that property that you're at. You can glean from all of the crops in there. Don't feel like you have to stay on the outside. You can go into the safety of this land. Don't feel like you have to do so from a distance. You can be closer than you want, than you think you can. Boaz was sharing with her the comforts of safety, of being close to him. So we see Boaz, he's foreshadowing Jesus' earthly ministry of helping the physical needs of those that were sick, and then fulfilling his grand purpose of providing eternal security for his people. So what Boaz was doing was meeting physical needs. What Jesus did was met physical needs as well. The blind man, the crippled man, the man who had to get lowered by his 4 friends through the roof of the building. All of these things were physical needs. Even the demonic oppression, it was a spiritual but yes, physical need as well, because they were harming themselves most of the time, and they needed to be freed. And so Jesus frees them through all of these things. He spares them from the issues that they had. Every single miracle was done to provide for physical needs, so that Jesus had an audience to speak to the spiritual needs of his people. So I think a lot of times when we read of the miracles of Jesus, I think a lot of times we just see the miracle and that's it. The point of the miracles is to point to what Jesus was doing at the beginning, and that was to meet their spiritual need. He was there to share the good news of why he had come. He didn't come to heal the lame. He came to heal them spiritually, to forever heal them. So we see Boaz's redemption of Ruth. It's orchestrated through the sovereign plan of God. Chapter 3, it tells a very interesting story. Whenever I was first told about the threshing floor, I thought it was kind of weird. What is she doing? Why is she here at night? If you read in the current culture that we have, or even in the culture of the Jewish mindset, a lot of people would say that Ruth was there to try to give him sexual favors in order for him to free her, to save her. And that's not at all what's happening here in chapter 3. So I'm going to read a couple of portions of it. So the very beginning, chapter 3, verse 1, we understand that Naomi is telling her daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. So she knows where he is. She has a plan to go and send Ruth, okay? And so he's finished eating, he's finished drinking. Verse 4, but when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. All right, so she goes and she lays by his feet. And first off, does anybody actually know why she uncovers his feet? Anybody actually know the significance of that? The reason for her to uncover his feet was one, there's actually multiple things that she was doing, but the first thing, he's at the threshing floor and he had a blanket on. It was probably cold outside. He was going to be startled, woken up. A lot of commentaries and commentators say that he was more than likely, she did this to wake him up, but also to show in the end that she needed help. And so she went down, verse 6, so she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of the grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant." And then she says this phrase, "Spread your wings." So first she's giving submission. She's understanding, I'm going to lay at your feet. I am yours. Whatever you need me to do, I will help. That's all I'm here for. I just want to submit to you because I need help. But then she says to spread your wings. What's important about that phrase, spread your wings? Well, she's not asking for a hug. She's not asking for a cuddle. She's actually asking for what's culturally, she's asking for him to put his blanket over her to signify that a new relationship was going to start between the two. That he was going to protect her. This blanket was a comfort. It was a shield over her. It was what it was to signify, that she was going to be comforted, was going to be safe under his protection. All right, verses 10 through 11, she said, "Hey, put your, spread your wings over me, for you are a redeemer." And then verse 10 and 11, and he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. You've not gone after the things that the world may want to go after. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." So she says, look, I need your help. I am desiring to be with you. I want to marry you. Spread your wings. Give me comfort. Give me this safety. And Boaz says, I will. He promises her comfort and safety. And so he has come to set her free of her pain and suffering. And so just like Boaz, Jesus has come to save his people. Isaiah 53:5 says this, "But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." The prophet Isaiah shares wisdom of all that the coming Messiah would do, that by his stripes his people would find salvation. He also explains the need for Jesus and what he was there to do. Just like Boaz, Jesus does not need us to do any favors for him, right? So we have this explanation of Ruth laying at his feet and being there. And the same thing we see with Jesus. He says for what? For us to come, to lay at his feet, to find rest at him. Come to me and I will give you rest, right? Come to me and I will carry your burdens. Lay your burdens at my feet. Boaz was doing the same thing. All Ruth had to do with Boaz was come to him and ask for his hand. All Jesus asked for us after he made the ultimate sacrifice is believe in him and his finished work. All right, so number 3, we see the marriage to redeem a bloodline and the marriage to redeem his church. So if you've read through the entirety of the book of Ruth, which I know some of you have, if you haven't, it's a very short book, so it's always a good read. Ruth and Esther are some of the shorter books in the Old Testament. So Ruth, you'll notice that there are several meetings that have different outcomes. One of the final meetings is in the 4th chapter between Boaz and the last obstacle between Ruth and him getting married. That's the other redeemer. Well, to understand and give context to the times of the narrative, whose land was it? Because the husband had died. It was Naomi. She was actually the one that was going to put it up for sale to say, look, somebody needs to buy this. Well, at that point, it was actually done by where you lived and how the lines that they had. That redeemer actually was first before Boaz. Well, his name's not really mentioned, but Boaz does call him a friend in verse 1 of chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, and sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. So he had an intentional meeting with him. But then in verse 2, we also know, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Well, why is he bringing elders to this informal meeting, supposedly? Well, he had purpose in it. He had to have witnesses for what he was about to do. So 3 through 6, this is so awesome. I just have to read all this. This is so good. 3 through 6 say this. Then he said to the redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. So he's put the ball, Boaz has put the ball in this other redeemer's court. He said, look, buy the land in front of all these people so you know you will redeem it. And if you will redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. I'm wondering in this moment, because it doesn't say Boaz, saying, hey, redeem it, and you'll get everything. And then the guy's like, I'll redeem it. He's like, oh, I didn't actually want you to redeem everything because I know what's involved. But let's finish verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Verse 6, then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So in this whole conversation, Boaz knows what's going to happen, but he also knows how to kind of shift the conversation to say, look, you can get the land, you get the thing that you actually want, but just know you're going to get Ruth as well. And this gentleman, this other redeemer says, look, I don't want to mess up my inheritance. I've got something set up. This isn't really what I wanted. You take it. So in God's providence, through all of this opportunity, Boaz now leaps at the opportunity to take the land, but most importantly, to buy the redemption of Ruth. And so it's really cool if you continue to read what happens and how they consummate this is he takes off his sandal, and Boaz, and he gives it to the other redeemer in front of all of these witnesses to let them know, this is mine. The redemption here was purchased through everybody noticing, right? So everybody that's noticed, you have visual of what I've done. And so, not only did he redeem Ruth, but through it all, Naomi, who at the beginning of the book was viewed as hopeless and accursed by God, is being blessed among the many women. So if you'll turn to 17, this is awesome to think about. Because I think a lot of people, they view the book of Ruth and they notice Ruth and Boaz, but you don't know her mother. You actually don't notice her mother. Her mother's an important character because at the beginning, she also gets redeemed through the whole book because at the beginning, she thinks she's hopeless. She's actually thinking that she's accursed by God. But by the end, in verse 17, we'll see this. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. She thought she could never get a kid. She thought she was never going to bless Ruth with having a child. She thought she was done. And it says, a son has been born to Naomi. That's intentional. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This is important because at the end of the book, it's going to close with the genealogy of David, the chosen king of Israel. And what's awesome about it is that the Moabite bloodline of Ruth is mentioned in it as well. So in closing, I want us to go all the way forward to Matthew chapter 1. If you have in your Bibles, Matthew chapter 1. We've seen the genealogy of David, but as many of you know, David's bloodline is whose bloodline? It's Jesus. And so in Matthew chapter 1, if my pages will stop getting stuck. We see the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And so it goes all the way from Abraham to Jesse, the father of David the king. But right above that, in chapter 5, it says, Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. Ruth is mentioned in the genealogy of David. But then not only that, but this is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. The verse before that, verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Why is it important that Ruth is in the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Matthew? Well, in that time, women were not mentioned in genealogies. It was mostly just men. It was the fathers that fathered, and he fathered him, and they fathered them, that's not culturally appropriate. It's he and he and he, right? We don't have they, them pronouns. But anyways, he, fathered him. And so why was it important that a woman was there? Well, to show right here that women, just like Ruth, would be redeemed through the bloodline of Jesus. Ruth, a Moabite woman, was followed into the kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ. Boaz's redemption of Ruth is far more than a love story. It is a typology that shows the coming Christ and all that he would do for his people. From allowing us to come into the security of his kingdom, to giving us hope through his son, to one day finally consummating it as bride in glory. I'll end with this, Ephesians 5, 27 through 28, which is awesome because we just got done talking about this on Sundays. Says this, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing and water of the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Let's pray. Dear God, I thank you for tonight. I thank you for the opportunity that we have just to open your word, Lord, going from chapter to chapter, from Old Testament to New Testament, to see the grand design of your plan to redeem your people to yourself. God, even in the small story of Ruth, we can see this foreshadowing of what you would do for your people. Lord, just like Boaz, who was the kinsman redeemer to Ruth, Lord, you are our redeemer. God, you have redeemed us out of the pits of sin, of despair and hell to yourself. God, and all you ask is, Lord, for us to repent and believe in you, to rest at your feet. God, I pray tonight for all of those in the room that, Lord, are even in conversations with others about knowing you. Lord, that you would we would be more intentional in it, God, to just proclaim your glory. We love you and thank you for all that you do for us. In your name, amen.